Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Successfully Managing Your Workplace During a Global Pandemic. Today, we'll be hearing from Sherrard Kuzz on how your business can manage and address a variety of issues during this pandemic and into 2021. These issues include health and safety, increased absenteeism, work refusals, accommodating human rights, the implications of a vaccine, and workplace restructuring. My name is Ala Dragola, and I'm the Director of Parliamentary Affairs and SME Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to thank the incredible sponsors who have made our Canadian Business Resiliency Network possible. In particular, I would like to highlight and thank today's webinar partner, Sherrard Kuzz, for the generous ongoing support of the CBRN during the COVID-19 pandemic. With us today is employment lawyer and partner at Sherrard Kuzz, Priya Sarin. Priya is an accomplished labor, employment, and human rights lawyer with a background in civil litigation. She has extensive experience advising and representing a broad range of for-profit and nonprofit management clients. While Priya places an emphasis on practical risk mitigating advice, she is no stranger to the courtroom and regularly advocates for clients in court and before Ontario's administrative tribunals. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Priya, to share your expertise with the group.
Thanks, Ala, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar on leading through a global pandemic. Unprecedented times, and businesses and the people that work for us are facing personal challenges in trying to and just survive. So today I'm going to be talking about 5 of the key challenges that I think many of you have been facing, or at least I've been hearing from my clients that people are facing. And these include the topics that Ala ran through just a minute ago: managing health and safety, absenteeism and work refusals, accommodating human rights, workplace restructuring, and issue on the list, how do we deal with the implications of a potential vaccine? So I'm going to spend about the next half an hour talking about these different issues, giving you hopefully some tips on how to address these issues as they come up. And then we'll be opening up the floor to a Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. So let's kick it off by starting with health and safety issues. So all employers, regardless of what province you're in Canada or territory, and I understand that there are folks from across Canada here today, you all have a duty to take reasonable precautions to protect the health and safety of your workers. So what does that mean in the context of a global pandemic? Well, during the pandemic, what this really means is that you need to take all steps to reduce and prevent the transmission of COVID-19 in the workplace, and that whole variety of different. So, for example, implementing new policies, setting it up so that your folks can work at home to the extent possible, requiring masking, screening at the entryway to your premises, enhanced cleaning protocols, setting up sanitizing stations, enforcing physical distancing, mandating the traffic flow, limiting the number of entries and exits to your workplace, implementing physical barriers between your workers if they can't be physically distanced, either from each other or from members of the public. And if you're in a line of work where your workforce has to travel a fair bit, minimizing travel to the extent possible. Important to note that masking and screening rules have changed quickly, and they're different in every province. So it's important to keep up to date what the new regulations are, either in your province or in your municipality, because, for example, in Alberta, some of the regulations only apply to in Edmonton. But what I would say to you, taking into account this idea that the employer has a duty to take all reasonable precautions, you want to be following the most cautious approach, not necessarily what is recommended or mandated. Because when it comes down to it, if there is an incident in your workplace, you're the one who's going to have to prove that you knew that there was a potential risk and didn't do everything that you could have done to protect your workers. So just coming back to what I mentioned earlier around screening requirements, if you're in Ontario, there's a mandatory screening requirement. for every worker and visitor place. And it's important to note that this screening requirement is an active requirement, not a passive one. And what that means is that you need to be doing something to record or document that people have been screened every day. Because if the Ministry of Labor shows up at your doorstep and asks for proof as to what you've done, you're not going to be able to show it if you just had a verbal, "You feeling okay? Great, come on in." Most provinces now, what we're seeing is there is a move towards making masks mandatory indoors, even in non-public areas. This is, of course, subject to limited exceptions, such as, for example, where there are medical reasons that you can't wear a mask or an individual can't wear a mask, or where they're not interacting with the public and they can still maintain physical distancing. So if I've got my own office, I'm not going to see or interact with another person, no problem. But I probably need to wear my mask if I'm in a common area, in the elevators, in the front entrance, etc. We're now seeing that these mask requirements are being implemented in BC and other provinces. So in BC, for example, the indoor mask law just came in November 24th, along with daily health checks on November 19th. And as I mentioned, Alberta just went down that road on November 24th as well. So I will say, some people are kind of saying, well, there's all these exceptions. So, how strictly do I have to follow this? One thing to keep in mind with accommodations, even around masks, is that just because someone can't wear a mask, it doesn't mean that the conversation ends. Someone says, I can't wear a mask because I need a medical accommodation, then the next thing you need to be looking at is, what other form of accommodation can I put in place? Can I still separate them? Is there a different type of mask that they can wear? Can I have them working in a different building? Can they work from home? It doesn't mean that they necessarily just stay in the workplace and don't wear a mask. So I mentioned also that you want to be looking at implementing policies, and that policies are necessary to meet the duty to take all reasonable precautions to protect your workers. Some of those policies might include mandating the use of PPE and providing training on use of PPE. I can see some people on camera right now that are wearing their masks together, so that's great. Policy, it's very hard to discipline your employees for breaching health and safety protocols. But it's important to have in writing. It's important to communicate what those policies are. And it's also important to think about what the consequences are if you fail to meet the legislated standards or to take these reasonable precautions. So Ontario, I can say that I know that there's been a blitz, and the ministry has hired at least 100 new inspectors to start enforcing the rules that they've put in place. This could mean significant penalties. If you don't comply with an order or a recommendation of the chief medical officer, individuals can be fined up to $100,000. Or officer could be imprisoned for up to a year. That's pretty significant. The fine, $100,000 if it's a director or officer, and the corporation, here's the big ticket, could be fined up to $10 million. So that's I'm sure many of you guys have heard about the Adamson's barbecue scenario in Ontario, in the Toronto area. I mean, this is what's going to happen. Like they have implemented the regulations. If you don't take them seriously, as far as I understand it, the owner of that business was in fact arrested and is facing a significant fine. Other penalties that you need to be aware of, for things that can impact your business, are stop work orders, work refusals, and penalties if there is in fact some kind of injury or a death in your workplace. Well, let's talk about absenteeism and work refusals. This is the second major challenge that we're seeing that companies are having. Some absenteeism is legitimate, some is not. And one of the things that you have to figure out is, why is the employee absent from work? Is there a valid reason for their refusal? And that analysis is, is there something that's unsafe? Is there a precaution that you haven't taken that's leading them to feel that anxiety or stress about coming into work? So, to that end, efforts that you take to promote a safe, healthy workplace will only help in improving anxiety around having folks come back to work. And question to ask, if the workplace is relatively safe or you have taken all those precautions, their absence that the worker is entitled to by statute. And there could be all kinds of reasons why someone needs to take a leave of absence. They're caring for someone at home. You have young children who, maybe their daycare is closed or their school is closed and they need to be there. They have an immunocompromised family member. So, turn your mind to whether or not there's a job protected leave that applies. And I'll talk about those a little bit more in a second. And then the third question is there a human rights reason why this individual can't come to work? So, for example, they themselves have a disability, they're immunocompromised. When someone says that they can't come in or it's related to COVID, things you need to consider. Is your workplace safe? Are they entitled to leave? Or are they entitled to some form of accommodation? So with the leaves of absence, it's important to keep in mind that, depending on where you are, eligibility requirements for the leave of absence are different everywhere. So in Ontario, they're very broad. I should actually go back for a second and say that all of the leaves of absence are unpaid and they're job protected. So it comes up fairly frequently. Do I have to pay them while they're on leave? No, you do not have to pay them while they're on leave. Do I have to protect their job? If it's related, meets the eligibility criteria for the leave under employment standards legislation in your province, yes, you do. You do have to hold their position for whatever that period of time is. In Ontario, they can take that leave for as long as they need to. It can be for a whole variety of reasons. So they're either, they're being investigated for their own COVID infection, they're under a quarantine order, they're caring or supporting a family member, and this could be anyone in their family. And one thing that people don't realize is if, let's say, for example, I choose to keep my kids at home, though their school is open, in Ontario, that employee is still entitled to the infectious disease emergency leave because it's related in some way to COVID-19, very broad. You don't have to pay them, but to that leave, and it is job protected. In BC, the leave is much narrower. It's still unpaid and job protected, but it's really relating to whether or not they're in quarantine or they're self-isolating. They're providing care to a minor child or dependent adult. So, that factor is still there, but it's not quite as broad as the way it's interpreted in Ontario. It's even more narrow. It's 14 days. It's really just focused around whether or not someone is self-isolating or in quarantine. In all of the provinces, you can't ask for a medical note. So that's something that comes up. There are obvious reasons for why, and part of it is if I might have COVID-19 and I'm being directed to stay at home, I shouldn't be exposing other people taking the bus or getting on transit or whatnot to go see the doctor and potentially then infecting people in the doctor's office. So to ask for a doctor's note in Ontario, you can ask for reasonable evidence, appropriate time. What does that mean? We can talk about that a little bit later, but it may mean that, let's say, for example, I'm staying at home because, or I'm saying that I need to stay at home because of my child, I might be able to ask for information from their daycare confirming that they're closed. Certain supports are unavailable. As I said, we've heard a fair bit from employers that issues with employees not wanting to come back to work or being afraid of coming back to work. And it's largely because they're concerned about what happens if they contract COVID-19 and whether or not it's safe. And so the number one thing I would say to employers in this scenario is that it's really important to communicate to your employees what you've done to try to improve health and safety and what you've done to protect them. That communication will go a long way. If you've done that, employees still not willing to return to work or they're still refusing to come back, then you need to treat this as a refusal under occupational health and safety legislation. And so the work refusal process, what does that look like? If they're at work and they're refusing, you would address the risk. So first look at that question one, is there actually something that I need to be worried about? Are they working next to a guy who's refusing to wear his mask? What is really going on there? Because you might think you've done everything, but maybe the problem is that it's not being enforced well enough in the workplace. So we'll look into that first. If we see nothing, there is no risk, then you can ask them to return to work. If they continue to refuse, then you can contact your applicable government agency, and so that might be the Ministry of Labor, and you get them to come in and investigate. Look at the situation and determine that there is no health and safety issue, then you're in a position where you can require that person to go back to work. You'll warn them of the consequences of not coming back to work, and if they don't, you can discipline them or consider it to be job abandonment. Depending on your particular situation in your organization, you may also consider this that time where you could just put someone on unpaid leave, to be nice about it. Okay, so let's move on to issue 3, or the third scenario, which is accommodating human rights. Accommodating human rights mean in the context of COVID-19, there are 2 main scenarios where we see this coming up, either in the context of disability or in the context of family status. So with disability, it usually means that the individual is immunocompromised and they have concerns about being exposed to other people in the workplace, and they're asking for an accommodation. The second scenario, family status, usually is coming up when someone has childcare issues. So that people always ask is, when is the duty to accommodate triggered? Well, it's when the employee comes to you and says, I have a need, and they're able to demonstrate that need to you. And the key here is need, it's not a preference. As an employer are entitled to ask for information to assess that need, and to confirm objectively that they really do have a requirement for some form of accommodation. In the case of a family care issue or a child care issue, entitled to ask, are there any other supports available to that individual to provide child care during the day? So if you have a spouse who's working from home, why is it necessary that you also work from home? And the employer is entitled to ask those questions. The second thing that comes up is, what is the scope of the duty to accommodate? And then this is when the lawyers say this thing, it's to the point of undue hardship, and everyone goes, what does that mean? Well, to the point of undue hardship means it must be more than a mere inconvenience. There is some hardship expected. It's a very high threshold to meet. The one thing that may come up in the context of COVID-19, though, is safety concern to others if you accommodate this individual. So that is a third factor that I would absolutely take into account. You need to think about whether or not you can accommodate them depending on what their need is. Can the employee still perform the essential functions of their job if you give them an accommodation? Your part, you should try to be creative and flexible about what form of accommodation you provide. It would include anything from work from home arrangements, flexible hours, frequent breaks, longer breaks. If they're back in the workplace, an assignment to a different client, or a different location of the business, or some sort of a rearranging their tasks that will minimize their risks or their exposures. Context of COVID-19, the analysis around whether or not they're entitled to a disability-related accommodation is no different, significantly different than any other request for a disability-related accommodation. You're entitled to ask for medical information to confirm that they have a disability and what the related limitations are. Again, you'll consider how those restrictions can be accommodated. Family status context. I mentioned earlier, a decision not to send your child to school, the fear of COVID-19, that's a preference. That is not, and so this is not an area where you would have a duty to accommodate the employee. Now in Ontario, as I mentioned, you can still get the infectious disease emergency leave and take an unpaid leave. That may not be the case in every province. But the duty to accommodate is not triggered unless they have to be home, not because they want to be home. So if school closes, daycares are not available, or they're only open 3 days a week, in that case, you would have a duty to accommodate. So, workplace restructuring. Who's facing businesses in Canada today? It's been challenging, keeping the lights on, trying to figure out how to meet either decreased demand or increased demand, depending on what your industry is. And there have been limitations on your ability to operate due to the government regulations that have been implemented, perhaps a need for different skill sets as a result of pivoting into a different direction with your business. And as a result of all these issues, either you haven't been able to afford to keep all of your staff, or you don't perhaps have the best resources available to you to continue to manage. Sort of options that you have available to you. The first one is the use of temporary layoffs. So we were seeing a lot of this earlier in the year, and we may be cycling towards this again as we come towards the end of the year and into lockdown. Tended to be temporary, not permanent. Province has different limits after which your layoff termination becomes a termination. You then have an obligation to pay termination pay and possibly severance pay, depending on which province you're in. It's important to be aware that have a common law right to pay off your employees. So what that means is, although many of your provincial employment standard statutes say that layoff can be, at least in Ontario, 13 weeks out of 26, for example, if your contract of employment with an individual doesn't say that you have a right to lay off the employee, they could claim constructive dismissal. In Ontario, we have the benefit of this legislation that was recently implemented during the pandemic in order to protect employers from this issue. And what the legislation now says is that an employee is not laid off for the purposes of the ESA during the pandemic period. So right now, that's March 1st to January 1st of 2021. They're not considered to be laid off. They're not considered to be constructive dismissal. And it's effectively put all layoffs on hold until the end of the emergency orders in January 2021, which is when the layoffs will then start. This is not the case in other provinces. They don't all have this legislation. So it's just important to be aware that for temporary, there is going to be a point where you hit a deeming provision and it's going to require you to pay termination pay. In Quebec, for example, I don't know if anyone here is from Quebec, but the layoffs can be up to 6 months. In BC, they're normally 13 out of 20 weeks, but they've been extended to 24 weeks. So you'll need to manage your workforce knowing that if you aren't bringing them back before then, that it's going to be considered a termination. The second tool that employers have been using is either reducing compensation or reducing hours of work. Again, you need to be aware that when you make pay cuts or impose pay cuts or reduced hours, this could also be considered a constructive dismissal. threshold for, how much is too much. We would say it's 10% for pay. Similar, if a total comp goes down more than 10%, you're at risk of a constructive dismissal complaint. Having said that, lots of businesses have done it in the past year, and they've done it successfully, but they've done it by asking employees to agree to the changes. If you can get buy-in, I think that there's a lot of empathy right now. If the alternative is no job, I would think that most employees, particularly if they have some loyalty to you, would be willing to do that. I just want to be clear that it's on a temporary basis, not permanent. When you're then looking to bring people back to work, you may have had to redesign your jobs, and that's fine. Just want to make sure that they're comparable and that employees are relatively in the same place as they were before, from a compensation and responsibility perspective. Think about at the time the order that you bring people back in to best suit how your positions are looking at this point in time. So you're looking at, who do you need for documented skills and abilities? How adaptable are they? Can they shift into other roles? Can they multitask? I also take into account how long has someone been with you? How productive are they? Caution I would leave with you on this point is to keep in mind the human rights concerns, and you want to make sure that you're not leaving an impression that you're calling people back in different orders based on a disability or their family status or some other human rights protected ground such as race, gender, etc. I want to talk about on restructuring is work from home. Many of us have been working from home quite successfully since the beginning of the pandemic. And to the extent that it's possible for you, remote work arrangements are the best way to prevent transmission of COVID-19 in the workplace, right? Minimize contact, minimize exposure. What this has meant is a lot of us had to rethink how we measure performance, how we measure productivity. I would caution employers who are expecting people to produce in exactly the same way. Some people have kids at home. We maybe have unstable internet connections. There's all sorts of things interrupting our day. I would suggest that employers focus on an employee's output as opposed to just the number of hours that they've worked. And to the extent that you can be more flexible about, what hours they're working, when they take breaks, that kind of thing. I think that would be the best way to ensure that you are continuing to meet the obligations of your businesses. The second thing to think about is, do your employees have the right tools and supports at home? Are you providing them with laptops, phones, supplies, etc.? And if you're not, how are you reimbursing them? Have you developed policies that explain how expenses work when people are working from home? Are you going to issue 2200s? Those are all things to think about. But probably the biggest thing, aside from sure that your IT systems and your confidentiality protocols are all up to snuff, for time. We're working from home. There's no separation between your bedroom and your desk. And people are working long hours. They're working odd hours. Tracking whether or not people are working their 40 hours or 44 hours, or if they're working 50 hours. And is there going to come a point in 6 months where breakdown in a relationship and your employee says, well, I was working 50 hours a week and you owe me, 200 hours of overtime. You have no records to dispute the claim. As an employer, it's your obligation to be tracking hours of work for the purposes of overtime and vacation pay. And given that we've seen in the past, I'd say 3 to 5 years a real in the number of class actions related to overtime and vacation pay, I would be saying to all of you right now to give some thought to how you're recording and tracking the hours that your employees are working. So are they still filling out timesheets online? Are they keeping a record and emailing them to you at the end of the week? Something that you keep track of. Didn't quite hint, as I just stated earlier, there are a number of we are doing right now to manage our businesses through various forms of restructuring that could give rise to a constructive dismissal complaint. So, as I mentioned, it doesn't provide a right to layoff that could give rise to a constructive dismissal complaint. Material changes to an individual's terms of employment, which could be anything from reducing compensation by more than 10%, reducing someone's or changing their title, changing their location of work. All of these could be things that amount to constructive dismissal. So on this point, we're talking about the fact that we're all working from home, or a lot of us are working from home. We might have to go back to work. Do that, you're going to permanently now work from home. Type of change could also be a constructive dismissal. So usually, and in the past, we've always thought of working from home as a benefit. Just get used to it. They like it. They don't want to come back. There's case law out there that where this issue's been litigated. There was a case where this woman worked from home 3 days a week and was told she was going to have to start coming into the office every day. And said, no, I mean, that's going to increase my gas costs, and that's too much for me, and this and that. And the court agreed with her, and they said that you're right, that's a material change to the terms of your employment. So how do we deal with that right now? I think it's really important for employers to make it clear that to the extent that we've got people working at home, this is temporary. The intention is for us to come back to work. If you're going to shift the other way, you want to get an agreement to that, because it could be considered a material change in the long run. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, temporary, but let's make sure that people know that. The last thing on the constructive dismissal point that I wanted to mention was surveillance. Asked questions about whether or not employers can employ monitoring software or tracking software to verify that their employees are logged on from certain hour to certain hour, that they're working as hard, they're being productive. I would really caution you on this. If you're going to implement any form of tracking software, just be mindful of privacy concerns. If you are surveilling employees without their knowledge, particularly when they're at home, this could give rise to all sorts of claims or complaints of a breach of privacy, or what we call the tort of inclusion upon seclusion. It's a significant risk. So how do we mitigate these risks? Get agreement to any changes you want to make. Offer working notice if you can't. Clear that any of these changes that you're making are temporary. There's one more topic that we're not going to forget because it's an important one. Implications of a vaccine. Very recently, we've heard very encouraging news about the prospects of a vaccine for COVID-19 from Pfizer, Moderna, and other companies. The vaccine will be ready sooner rather than later, and that Canadians will have access to it sooner rather than later. Many of you are starting to ask questions about whether they can or should be making it mandatory for staff to get the vaccine once it's available. Other preliminary questions we should be asking first, though, when will it be available after get access? Or will it have side effects? Individuals in your organization be unable to take it because of their own medical issues or possibly religious or other issues. You need to stagger the vaccinations. If, for example, it requires multiple doses and there's an isolation period required between doses. And the most important question is, how long will immunity last, even if it's out there? We just don't know enough. So then when we turn to the question of, can you make it mandatory? Well, no, you can't make a vaccine mandatory. It's considered to be an intrusion on an individual's privacy and their bodily integrity. It's been considered before. It's been considered in respect of the flu vaccine. So we would generally say to employers, you can't force get a COVID-19 vaccination, but you can encourage it. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions where you can make it a condition of work are really limited to the healthcare context and to long-term care, where they're working with vulnerable workers. And even in that scenario, you can't make someone get the vaccine, but what you can say is, if I work in this environment, I need you to take this vaccine for the safety of the individuals that we're working with. Your option is to take paid leave, an unpaid leave. So you wouldn't be firing them. You would be either reassigning them to a different role or finding some other way to deal with the situation, but you can't force it on them. And I would say in this case, terminating your employees. Last thing, of course, to keep in mind here is, once the vaccine becomes available, if you want to encourage your employees to take it, also keep in mind that there are human rights considerations and reasons why people would not be able to take the vaccine. I think, questions. I'll open the floor.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was a lot of really, really interesting content. As a reminder to everyone here that we are taking questions through Slido, and the code for Slido, if you do want to submit a question, is T309. So we do have a few questions right off the bat that have been submitted throughout. The first one is, what do I do if an employee appears to be abusing the company's sick leave policy by claiming to potentially have COVID-19?
Okay, so as I mentioned before, you're not allowed to ask for a medical note. However, you are entitled to reasonable evidence at an appropriate time. So if it seems like there's a pattern behavior where this is coming up repeatedly, like every 2 weeks on a Friday, your employee thinks they have COVID, that's the time when you can ask for reasonable documentation to prove that, or to substantiate their absence. And if an employee is in fact abusing your sick leave policy, you would have the right to discipline them.
Perfect. So there's a couple questions also related to this. Can I do anything if I become aware that an employee has been engaging in risky behavior after work and on the weekends?
That's a really interesting question. So this raises the whole conversation around off-duty conduct. And I think one of the first things that you want to look to is whether or not your province or your city has imposed any form of restrictions. So, for example, I'm in Toronto, and we have limits on socializing with other households. We're not, even outside, not supposed to be socializing with more than a certain number of people. And if you become aware that one of your employees is breaking those bylaws and regulations by, they're at an indoor house party with 25 other people, and you see pictures on Facebook, you're now in a position where they've done something unlawful. And you may in fact be able to take disciplinary steps, or you may be able to prevent them from coming into the workplace and say, look, I'm aware of this. I'm putting you on an unpaid leave.
Right. Another one's also similar, but a little bit more specific. It says an employee has been off since September and will not disclose the reason for their absence. Their doctor has provided 2 letters with no estimated return date. What are my next steps?
Okay, so that's a broader accommodation question outside of the context of COVID-19. But what I would say to that is that, as an employer, you're entitled to reasonable medical documentation to substantiate an absence from work. I'd be seeking further and better medical. You don't have to accept a one-line medical note that just says that they're off. You're entitled to know that they have a disability and what the restrictions and limitations are around that.
Okay. Just in relation to other ones, do I have a duty to accommodate an employee who lives with an immunocompromised family member?
So that's also a great question. I would say yes, you do. That would fall, even if it's not their own disability, it's a family status issue. They have, a care and an obligation to their family member. And if you're being a good employer, you would accommodate that issue. And there are many ways to look at what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean the individual has to work from home unless they can, but it could mean additional protections or reassignment to a different unit within the workplace that would minimize their exposure to COVID-19.
Okay. Is it common practice to get all employees to complete a COVID screening form for each shift? If so, what is the best and most efficient way to do this?
So you need to do a screening form when the individual enters the workplace on each day. So if they're coming in for one shift a day, then the answer is yes. I think there's 2 ways you could go about it. I mean, one would be to have them fill out a form online before they physically arrive and just send it in electronically. And that seems to work well for many organizations. And then you've already got the documentation kind of stored in one place. The other would be for them to sign off a form when they arrive. But then I don't think that's quite as efficient, because then what happens is if there's an issue or they screen with, they are having some symptoms, then you have to isolate them and remove them from the workplace. And someone's got to deal with all the paperwork. Yes, if I were to answer that question, my suggestion would be to have it done all electronically in advance if possible.
Okay. Turning to vaccines, there's a couple questions here. Number 1 is, can you force an employee to prove that they've had the vaccine as a condition to physically come back to work?
So I'm presuming this would be in a healthcare context, because you can't force someone to have a vaccine as a condition of work. And I didn't quite touch on this in my presentation, but even Canada says we don't mandate vaccines.
The other vaccine-related question is, I have a co-working space and people run their own businesses that people run their own businesses from, but some of them also work for me. If they don't want to get a vaccine, can I still ask them to wear a mask?
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, I don't think that the two are exclusive. And there's, even once the vaccine is out there, we may still require people to be wearing masks in the workplace. We don't know enough about the efficacy of the vaccine or what the process is going to look like. So, how I mentioned that there might be a transitional period. We don't know who's going to get access when, how long it takes before it's effective, or the time between the doses. People start getting vaccinated. If they're still coming in, you're going to want everyone to be masked until everyone's been vaccinated. Anyhow.
Okay, so kind of like a hybrid approach there is what you would recommend until we know more. The next question we have is, what options does an employer have if they believe that a full-time employee who's working from home is also working from home with another employer simultaneously?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. What option does an employer have if they believe that a full-time employee who is working from home is also working from home for another employer simultaneously?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess the first thing is whether or not the employee has a contract that's exclusive, that would prevent them from working for more than one organization. There are a lot of individuals who do side contracts in the evenings or whatever. If they're not getting their work done, if they're not producing what they should be producing, I think really what you're saying is there's a performance issue, and I would pursue that first. Prohibited from working from other organization, and then I would just ask the question directly.
Okay. Related to that, and I know you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, is do you recommend investing in software that will track employee productivity?
I don't. It's intrusive and to some degree demonstrates a lack of trust in your workforce. I would generally recommend pursuing the line of approach where you communicate your expectations to people. You set out, what flexibility there is in the schedule for them to manage their own time. And, if they're not producing to your expectations, that you then, performance manage them and move down that route. But I don't think that tracking people really positive relationship between you and your staff.
Got it. Next question is, it sounds as though T2200s are not automatically issued by the employer. If that's the case, what are the next steps for those working from home?
Yeah, so I think you could ask your employer whether or not they'd be willing to issue a T2200. But there are, I think I read actually very recently, yesterday in the budget or not budget rather, the plan that will be an automatic, I think it's $400 deduction for individuals who are working from home for expenses related to that. I guess that's the alternate.
Yeah, exactly. Just to supplement that, because I was nose deep in the fall economic statement yesterday, it is a $400 deduction without having to go through the T2200 for employees. So more details, I guess, about that will be when you file your taxes. So tag team here. So that's all that we've got through Slido for questions at this moment. I'm going to leave it open just for a little bit longer because we do have about 10 minutes left. But Priya, maybe I'll ask you, is there anything else that you really want to highlight, maybe that you haven't stated? We actually just got one more question coming in through here. Maybe I'll ask that and then I'll turn it back to you for a last word. So the question is, just to confirm, if we find out one of our employees is not following bylaws around social gatherings, we can discipline or terminate them.
Okay, so I didn't suggest termination, but what I would say is that, okay, first of all, COVID policy that explicitly sets out what the expectations are, including following all regulations related to COVID-19. If you do, you can discipline under your policy. But what I was suggesting is that if you become aware that someone is not following those protocols, they're a risk and you don't want them in your workplace and potentially putting your colleagues at further risk from a health and safety perspective. So I think in that situation, you would be well within your rights to put them on an unpaid leave, which is, like a directed self-isolation. And I would explain to them why.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that, they ask, do we need to have the employee sign an agreement that says they will comply with the bylaws or regulations?
I would generally recommend getting sign-off on new policies that you implement in the workplace anyway. So, I mean, indirectly, yes.
Okay. Perfect. Well, I think this is a good opportunity for me to turn it over to you to if there's any final words or any kind of recommendations or anything. For those who were asking, this is being recorded and will be available on the CBRN website, as well as an email copy to all of you afterwards. But Priya, I'll just turn it over to you for a final word now.
Sure. I guess the last thing I would just say is that, these are tough times and everyone is dealing with their challenges. I think this is the time to example and show empathy and compassion for your employees to the extent possible. Also say that communication is critical in this time, especially if we're not all together in the same place. To remember that, things don't always come across as well over email, and sometimes just picking up the phone and having honest conversations with people can help. They can go a long way to keep us connected, to keep our mental health intact, to make people feel like they're still part of the team. And I think that that's just kind of, I think, the last thing that I would employers.
Perfect. Well, on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I just want to say thank you so much to you, Priya, and to Sherrard Kuzz for your ongoing support of the Canadian Business Resiliency Network. And a big thank you to everyone here who joined us today. You can learn more about the Chamber's efforts and access additional resources on our website at chamber.ca. So with that, we're going to sign off, and thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.